Welcome to Running the Show, a podcast that explores the intersection of running and business. Now, we've already had a few episodes on the Netflix series that's coming out soon enough, and we're at a point where we want to bring in subject matter experts. And for our first expert on the podcast, we're bringing in friend and teammate, just all-around great person, Laura Thweatt, to lend the perspective of an athlete in this situation. So, for those who are unfamiliar with Laura, she's an American distance runner who currently focuses on the marathon after many successful years competing in the 10K. She's partnered with Saucony for 10 years. She's shown adaptability, durability, resilience in a highlight career as a runner and a personality in the running space. In addition to Laura's exploits as an athlete, she coaches Monarch High School in Colorado, and she is currently a contributor and founding member of the Relay podcast. Now, in our conversation, Laura lends her experience and expertise to discuss the athlete side of a docuseries. She and her agent, Daniel, they explore the hypothetical situation of an athlete-agent conversation. They bring up their concerns and questions they would need to get answered and get more clarity on before they sign on the dotted line and become the face of a docuseries like this. We'll link Laura's socials and everywhere you can follow her in the show notes. Please enjoy. Cool. So today, right, we're talking and getting your perspective on the Netflix series that's coming out on track and field in this summer, conceivably. And the perspective that I feel like you bring very well is the athlete side, but also, right, you're foraying into podcasting as well. It then gets into the media and content creation side as well. So I figured we would talk all things as relates to that, getting your perspective, because my blind spots are massive in this. So I appreciate your time today, Laura.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to dive into this. Also, I am a huge fan of documentaries, especially sports documentaries. Like, I watched The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan one, like 8 times. Like, I find it fascinating when they like dive into the world of like highly competitive athletics and like especially like the greats at those sports, and just like the backstory and kind of just like what makes these athletes who they are, like on and off the court. I love that. So I'm really excited to talk about this, and I'm excited that Netflix is bringing track and field into its mixture, because there's so many out now.
Yeah, was the Last Dance kind of your gateway into this, or had you been a fan of sports docs for a while?
That was kind of my gateway. And then I went through like a really big phase of like reading like sports books. So I obviously read like Kara's book and Lauren's and Dez's. And then like I like segued into like reading about LeBron James and like his story. And then I got into like The Last Dance. And then I started Point Break, the tennis one. And then I watched Unchained because I'm a huge cycling fan. I don't cycle myself, but I dive into cycling. I love the Tour de France. I grew up watching it. I sort of, in like a weird way, know Sepp Kuss. So humble brag. Anyway.
The connection, right?
Yes. But this is the connection though. So Sepp is a lot younger than me, so we didn't overlap in high school. He also went to CU, so go Buffs, but we didn't overlap there. But our moms do Pilates together, and they talk about us. So in that way, I know him.
I love how like people go to Pilates and strike up conversations for a whole host of like ways, but they're like, "Oh, is your son a professional athlete? My daughter's," and like that becomes that one might be one of the more Colorado-isms that we've heard.
My mom's always like, "Yep, talk to Davina today. Like, Sepp's doing really great. Like, they're really excited. Like, this is what he said." And I'm like, what do you say I'm doing? Like, I feel like I'm not as cool. Like, you're like, oh, yeah, Laura, just living in Boulder, training for marathon, living in Andorra. You know, like, my life is not as exotic.
I was just going to say that, like, it seems like the sports lend themselves to different things to talk about, where they're talking about you and him, like, you two know each other because of, like,
yes, we've, like, never met.
Right, and then they're just like, oh yeah, Sepp's in Andorra again, and then he's just like, oh yeah, we're just gonna run New York in November or something.
Yeah, that's 100% how the conversations go. So every time I meet like a big cyclist fan, which is very easy to do here in Boulder, it's like, half of our teammates are big cyclists. I can drop that. And then they're like, what? And I'm like, I know. Sep and I, we're pretty close. So anything you want to know, I'll ask his mom.
I love that. And just when you were talking about getting from like the written side of like sports, just like records of sports and especially like athletes, and then kind of transitioning into the visual side of it, just in that vein, what things do you feel like come to life a little bit more on the visual side when you watch Breakpoint or you watch The Last Dance, as opposed to reading about, maybe the depth of like LeBron James's trajectory to being who he is today, but like, does it feel different when you're watching?
Yeah, I feel like when you're watching it, you're like, I'm such a visual person, so I feel like I'm really being brought in to their world. And again, like I like dabble in watching like the NBA and like I dabble in like watching tennis here and there, but like I wouldn't say I'm like a fan of those sports. Like I don't watch enough or know enough about like the athletes I'm watching to like really feel connected. And then you watch these documentaries and it brings you into those sports in a completely different kind of like behind the scenes way. And I'm someone that like you give me a backstory or like you introduce me to an athlete and like show me how they grew up or like kind of show me like why they are the way that they are or like what their journey looked like. And I'm like instantly like I'm in that sport. So like, again, I think the visual piece of it is huge because it kind of just like, it brings you into a world that you're not familiar with. And you suddenly kind of feel like you're getting this like secret kind of like insider look into how it operates. And I find that fascinating being in sports myself, but in such a very different sport. It's kind of cool to see how athletes in all of these different arenas, like how they train, how they operate, what their lives look like all of that stuff. And it's cool too, because as you're watching these documentaries, there's so many parts that are like relatable being an athlete myself and just like the pressure and like having to show up in like one day, one moment, like, like the big opens and like, the NBA finals and, the Tour de France and like these huge mega stages that athletes dream about and train for their whole lives. And then seeing them get there, but then like seeing that they're also human just like you and they're like nervous and they're feeling the pressure, some crack under the pressure. Like it's all very cool. And so I immediately just feel like I'm suddenly playing the Australian Open, like you're in it with them. So I love that piece of like watching a documentary. I think that's what's so cool about it.
Yeah. And I feel like the platforms in which that we consume them is also an interesting thing to consider because, we're talking about things on Netflix and we're talking about things that are on like Hulu or HBO Max or some kind of like legacy media and to some extent. Whereas I feel like going beyond live, to use that quote from Sevco, in track and field right now is mainly achieved only through YouTube. Mm-hmm. If you want that perspective, right, there's like different docuseries that are produced by different brands or just independent companies or even athletes like about themselves, which is interesting. But just curious to get your perspective on like the way that people are creating media right now through like the lens of YouTube. Does any of it resonate with you, or are there things that like you'd want to see also included in something more like, let's say, professionally done on a channel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like I haven't like done a deep dive into like the YouTube platform. But I do think it's really cool that like athletes are like trying to like, especially in running. I feel like running is such a difficult one because it's not super mainstream. And like outside of the Olympics, people are like, oh, that's cool. You run track and field. Like, do you just race in the Olympics? And you're like, okay, no, like it's like everything else. Like there's seasons and there's diamond leagues with points and there's world majors and there's all these other things like throughout the 4 years leading up to an Olympics. And so I think it's cool that athletes are using what's at their disposal, like, TikTok and Instagram and then like YouTube, which allows athletes to even do a deeper dive into like day-to-day life or training, or again, trying to like give people a glimpse into like what it is that we do. And so I think that's why this series coming out was so exciting when I was like, oh, they're actually going to finally do something on track and field and like shed light on our sport, just like they're trying to shed light now on all of these other sports. that outside of that sports fan base, again, like people are like, they don't understand. So again, I think we live in a day and age where athletes can really market themselves and can kind of do that in like a more off the cuff, like kind of unprofessional way, which I think is also really relatable. And I think people really resonate with that kind of media as well. But it's cool that there's finally going to be a little bit more of a professional lens focused in on the sport of track and field. And they're starting with like the 100 and the 200, which again, I think is like pulling from like maybe a little bit of a deeper fan base as far as like who the athletes are that they're focusing on. But I think that's really cool because again, like as an athlete, it's really hard to like always know how to market yourself and like how much you want to share, how much you don't like. But again, trying to kind of build that brand around yourself, like, you know, help kind of market sponsors and like, it's so hard to like to figure all of that out. And everyone has got a different strength and everyone is comfortable with different levels of that. So yeah, I don't know, but.
It's a really good point that you bring up that I have not been giving enough credit in the scope of marketing or content as it relates to running right now in other sports too, is short form media. It's the IG reels, it's TikTok, it's ways that you can still bring people beyond live, to keep using that phrase, without having to like put several hundreds of thousands of dollars behind it. Wow. And to, you know, have to film a ton of continuous work and B-roll and all these other shots. Like it, to your exact point, it is a little bit easier for people to kind of DIY their experience there. But right, there's also the challenges if it's like such a crowded space. Like how do you stand out in a way that the almost like the rubber stamp of approval of like a legacy media thing, like the fact that it's a Netflix docuseries instead of a YouTube series or YouTube TV series feels different. To exactly what your point. So to go down that like that rabbit hole with you, right, with bringing in your perspective of this, a question that I wanted to kind of explore with you, or a situation I wanted to explore with you, is like, let's imagine this scenario where your agent's coming to you, telling you about this series that's about to happen, and they're like shopping around for athletes they want to feature in a docuseries. What kind of questions do you have, does your agent have that you need answered in order to say like, yes, I'm interested?
Yeah, so I kind of like role played that, and like I hypothetically like reached out to my agent yesterday, and I was like, listen, what if a company like Netflix came to you and was like, we want to do a docuseries on like a marathon, on like marathon runners, like building for a world major, and we'd like to, you know, include Laura in that. Like, are you interested? And so I initially had a bunch of questions. Like my first one was like, okay, like let's say like Netflix comes to you. Well, do I get paid for that? Like, right. You're obviously giving a lot of your time. You're giving them that inside peek on the track, but also off of it, I'm assuming. And like, it's going to be what seems like a rather like extensive kind of journey. So I was like, do I get paid? And he said, you should get, if it's like a Netflix, like if they're coming to you and it's like a docuseries kind of like that, like what they're going to be doing with like the sprinters, he was like, you definitely should, there should be payment involved in that. And he was like, it would be different if it was kind of more of like, what did he say? He was like, if it was more of like a traditional documentary and like PBS was airing it, he was like, obviously like payment wouldn't be like appropriate. So it really just depends on like what outlet is coming to you and like what it is that they're wanting to kind of do. So that was my first question. And then my second question was like, okay, cool. But having been a consumer myself of these documentaries, like they show a lot. And like, it's not just the matches. It's not just like, you know, the games, like they're showing kind of like, they're trying to give viewers an inside look into the athlete's life. So I'm like, how much like on the track do they want to shoot? Like how much training? And then like, how much of my life do I have to open up for people to see? And he said that can be like really dependent on like what you're comfortable with. And like, obviously, as you were saying earlier, like they're going to want B-roll and they're going to want, you know, to kind of give viewers a little bit of an idea of like what a day in the life looks like. And then he was like, probably also you'd want to ask like, how much of my training are you going to show? Not that I'm like super secretive with how I train, but again, like it's kind of, you don't want like exactly like what you do in a marathon build, like week by week, like, shown to the world. Like again, I think as athletes, like there's some privacy we want around how we prepare. So he was like, you would, make it clear to them that they can do clips, they can come to certain workouts, but like the way they show that, they're only showing pieces of what you're doing or pieces of a workout versus like all of it.
Right.
And so, yeah, so that was a question. And then,
Question
yeah,
we're on that. Cause like, I totally get that of like, you don't want to show the secret sauce of like, whether that's coaching that you are doing for yourself or that like a coach is providing for an athlete. And it reminds me of like, even in Hard Knocks, the football series, right? That comes out on a week-to-week basis. So that's like it shows maybe the tactic, or like you'd be afraid of it showing off tactics they would employ in a game versus a certain opponent. And they do a really good job of keeping that like out of line of sight. And even in the scope, like let's say this Netflix series is filming now, it's going to probably come out the following year at the earliest. You still don't want to show too much from a training perspective, because it's not going to be drastically changing year to year. It's going to be improvements most likely. But on the side of like, all right, how much are they getting beyond running? Do you have any like reservations about that personally? You're like, yeah, I'm cool with them doing day-to-day stuff, coming with me like when I'm doing my coaching, but like in terms of my family out of this, or like what kind of things feel like a boundary that you would draw as an athlete?
Yeah, I think I would want to also respect the people in my life that like, would potentially like be on film, and making sure that everyone's comfortable with like whatever that looks like, whether it's like interviews or again, just showing day-to-day life. Like, would I want them to come to like my like physical therapy appointments, like my massage appointments, like, is that like too invasive, or like, am I comfortable with that? Or, and it's like, I don't mind like showing a day in the life. Like, I think it'd be cool to bring them to like my high school practice and like kind of showing that piece of like what I do on the other side of the sport. So I don't have like a lot of reservations. I guess like I'm someone like I operate my social media where I'm always trying to find that balance though of like, I want to share like my journey, and I want to like be able to have that relatability to like whoever is reading my posts. Like we're kind of like, like you want to be able to share with people and connect and open up. But at the same time, like I want certain parts of my life to be private. So I don't really do a lot on my social media with like my personal life, like, who I'm dating or like, a ton of family stuff. Like I try and keep that like very separate. So I think that would probably be kind of how I would operate like a Netflix docuseries, is like you're wanting to invite people in and really kind of show them. Because that's always my thing, is I'm like, people don't fully understand, especially if you're not in the sport, like what it takes to do what we do. Like it is fucking hard. Like it is so hard. Everyone's like, oh, that's cool, you're a professional runner. Like you run and then like you don't do anything all day. And it's like, okay, but there's like so many other things that come into that. Like your running is your career. It's how you make money. Like performances are how you do that. Like, you're training really hard. Like you're always having to recover and think about what you're eating. And like, you have to sacrifice social life and like all of these things in a big build. And like, there's just so many things that I think would be cool for people to kind of get a little bit of a snippet of like, it's awesome what I do. And I'm not going to like sit here and complain about what I do for a living, because I'm truly living my dream. And I feel so lucky to do it, but like, it's really hard. And like a lot of people don't see that day in and day out grind that like comes with kind of like, with doing this as a living. So I would want to like showcase that. But then again, like there's just certain things that I'm like, that's for me. And like, I don't want to invite people into that part of my life.
Yeah. And I get that. I don't see you like necessarily complaining that people are, about like the circumstances of what it takes to be a professional athlete. I think I see it more you like kind of pleading for the respect on that side there, right? And just like, hey, you don't have to have an opinion about it, but at least be indifferent.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well, because not too much to ask.
Yeah. To act like anybody's athletic journey, especially at that echelon of the sport, is easy, or, oh, Laura has contracts.
Yeah.
And then make their assumptions, and they create opinions based on a false sense of like security that they assume is built into that lifestyle, for example. Yeah, that doesn't solve for everything. So I totally get that. What are some of those other questions you have on deck?
Yeah, so I also I was curious with like how long would filming last, and like that's obviously like very dependent on like what they're filming, kind of like what that build looks like. And like this Netflix documentary, like my agent was saying, it would depend on like how many other athletes they're involving in the series. And so he was like, if they're focused on like the New York City Marathon, right, and they're focusing on like key marathon players, like as they build to that, he was like they probably only would really have time to come like maybe for a week, and then it would be like it would be like a very extensive week. Like they would come to training, they would follow you around, they would probably interview coaches or like teammates or people in your life, and like they would do interviews with you, and like he's like it probably would look about like a week or so, and then maybe like what they're doing for the Netflix documentary with like the sprinters is it's like they would do a kind of like an intensive week of like you and just like your day-to-day as you prep for something like this. But then if you're like competing in like en route to like the New York City Marathon, like, would they come to those races, so it would kind of be like an extensive week-ish, and then like maybe here and there as like the buildup is getting like closer to like the big day and things like that. So that was a question that I had, because I was just like, is this like a month thing? Or are they here all the time? How long are they like around, right? So
yeah, to that point as well, it kind of like draws attention to how different disciplines in running, as capital R, would be or could be featured differently. Whereas like you're thinking of, you said you've been watching Breakpoint, just like the schedule of that, of going to like Indian Wells and seeing that tournament play out. Like there's X amount of matches that they know they can get footage from. And yes, there are some like, hey, pre-tournament things that are being filmed, but competition itself is also a lot of footage with a lot of different like players in the space, right? You're playing against, if you go all the way to the finals, potentially like 4 different opponents. And there's different storylines you're woven in. With something like the marathon or longer distance, right? You're not necessarily racing a ton leading into it. And building up something like a marathon I would say, robs the opportunity of, let's say, several competition storylines, but it does make it more difficult to say like, all right, they're spending a week with Laura. What story are they telling with Laura? As opposed to just like, hey, Laura, like you should love Laura for these personality traits that she exudes, and then see her compete. It's kind of like, all right, if it's a block of training for each person going into it, what story or what narrative is being placed around that athlete? And as I say that, what like does that feel accurate or maybe even uncomfortable with like how that could be outside of your influence? That somebody can come into your space and then be like, this is the Laura story.
Yeah, this is kind of how we want to like build it. Yeah, I think to a certain extent, because again, like that's the part, like the reason like these sports documentaries are really taking off is because of like the producer's abilities to kind of like create this story, right? Like, and like what people are prepping for, or like big matches, or like, seasons with like, big like NBA finals and things like that. Like it's about the story, like people really resonate with that. So yeah, I mean, like Dan had a good point. He was like, how would they do this where like it's like it brings people in, and it's like catching, and like people want to like watch it. And so he was like, I think it would be cool if you did like a build to a world major, but like you're following athletes from all over the world. So it'd be really cool, I think, to see how like someone in Ethiopia is prepping for the New York City Marathon. How is someone from Kenya prepping from that? How is someone from Japan prepping for that? How is someone from South America prepping for that? Like how are like the top 4 Americans or top 3 Americans in the field prepping for that? Like he's like, I think it would be really cool, because he's like, we don't really get to see that. Like you can kind of see that through like interviews and again like social media and YouTube and like however athletes are being marketed. But he was like, that would be a really cool like inside look, is like you would form like every athlete's journey to a world major start line is so very different. You have people like Safan Hassan who run the world championships 6 weeks before Chicago. Like that's a story. Like I'm not doing that, and then you have people like me or even like Bates who like, we don't race really at all in a build to a marathon, but like that's a whole different way to prep. And like, why do we approach it that way versus someone like Safan, or, you know, again, just like focusing on all the different athletes in Ethiopia and Kenya who like have, you know, these huge camps and like the best in the world are all training together. Like everyone approaches it so differently. So like that would kind of be, I guess, like the hopeful storyline is like no one really gets to see that. And it's kind of like, again, that's why like Point Break is so cool and things like that, because they're focusing on like, you know, American athletes, Australian athletes, you know, like British athletes. So it kind of be like you do the same for the marathon, but then it's creating a kind of little storyline for each person. And it would be cool to be like, well, what's your why? Like, why did you pick the New York City Marathon? Like, why did all of these athletes pick it? And like, what's the driving like force for them to train for something like this? And like, how do you get into the elite field at the New York City Marathon? Like a lot of people don't know how that even works. Like, what do appearance fees look like? What do big major marathon contracts look like? Like no one knows. No one knows. Like even people in the sport don't know like that world majors, that is how marathoners make money. That is how you make money. And those deals are how people pick marathons. Like that's, I mean, you know, but like we don't talk about that and there's no transparency with that. So I think that would be an interesting angle too.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, also this is, I feel like we got to put like a, you know, this is copyrighted material here. This is your intellectual property. These storylines that you're saying, you know,
yeah,
to steal this.
Yeah, don't. I know I'm giving away too much. I got too excited. Dan and I were talking about this last night, and I was like, "That would be cool. Why is no one doing that?"
Right. It would be super cool, right? Like you were saying, right? You see, you kind of play at this narrative of how global this race is and how it's a world stage, and then everyone descends into New York and has their own, let's say, fish out of water experience as well, because you being a top American athlete, like you train in Boulder, you're at altitude, you have a certain way of life that you experience here. That's different than Kira D'Amato coming up from like, you know, the second, right, in the East Coast there, and especially somebody coming in from another country. But yeah, if they could, I would love for people to like be able to talk about, yeah, my appearance fee is X amount of dollars, but I have to go through 16. Or, you know, or like I have to finish the race in order to get paid out my appearance fee. And then seeing how that in itself is like drama you're building, right? If you see somebody who's like falling off pace, let's say their appearance fee like triggers if they run like 2:35 on it. And it's like, you are looking at them now, even though they're not like in the front of the pack, like, is that person going to get paid today?
Yeah.
That is such a wild concept that has this kind of gamblers aesthetic.
Yeah, 100%. I'm like, bring people into the fold of like the business of it and like why athletes are picking the marathons that they're picking and like what is on the line, right? And the marathon's a crazy event because you dedicate essentially 3 to 4 months solely for this one day. And there's so much riding on this one day. There's you still need the stars to align and you still need like luck on your side. And like, if you knew what people were really racing for and like what was added into just like the pressure of like, you obviously want to perform, you want to have a huge day on a huge stage, like all of that aside, like it's also a huge payday. And so people make decisions in the race that reflects that. Like, why do people finish? They're like, oh, why did she finish that marathon? Well, I don't know. Maybe because she had, you know, that was like, that was her, like, that was her livelihood was depending on her finishing.
Yeah. But
yeah.
That's just why, I think like it does play upon that dichotomy of like, hey, these athletes are similar to you. They're accessible because they're just people at the end of the day, but also they're very different because, right, like, yes, we all experience different stressors and things that lead our lives in terms of like how we assess risk. But in the way that somebody goes to a 9-to-5 to pay their mortgage, somebody's racing New York to pay their mortgage.
Yeah, you're running a 2.5-hour race to pay your mortgage. Like I bought a condo like 10 years ago, and it was just when I was starting to kind of like dip my toe into the marathoning world. And I like after my first marathon in New York, I like had a great day and I made a ton of money. And I was like, holy shit. So then I started doing this thing where like every major I did, I was like going to do a new home project based off of like the money that I walked away with. So like New York paid for all of my appliances. London paid for new cabinets. Like new floors. Like I literally like, that's what I did is like, I bought this condo and then like I had a mortgage and then I couldn't like fix it up all at once. And so like my marathons were paying for like essentially like all of these things and like, important things in life. So I don't know. It's just funny, but like, that's how much rides on these marathons, and it would be so interesting to see like what athletes around the world, like what these marathons mean to them, and like winning the New York City Marathon, like what does that do for an athlete, running for Ethiopia, like how does that change their life? How does it change like, and like there's just so many storylines. And like, I think, and Dan's point was like, yeah, you could do like a build up to like the US Olympic trials, but he was like, what would be cool is if you did a build up to a world major, because you'd have all of these different storylines from all over the world. And like New York, like a marathon like New York, like that's also like that people are gonna, this is a hot take, I think a world major, especially one like New York, is harder than the Olympics. And I think it's harder in ways than the Olympics because you can have 7 Kenyan athletes, you can have 6 Ethiopians, you can have 15 Americans. Like you can literally have the Olympic trials, the US Olympic trials against, like there's like, in the Olympics, it's like you get like 2 or 3 from each country. And again, Olympics, amazing, not taking from it, but like, I don't think people understand like a world major and like the stage that is, and like how like being top 3 at a world major, I mean, it's equivalent to an Olympic Games, like I just don't think people look at it that way. And in some ways it's almost harder because the depth is so different. And so you'd also be showcasing like, yeah, okay, you watch the Olympics every 4 years, you watch track and field, you watch the marathon, cool. But then it's like people don't realize like every year is, especially in the marathon, every year is an Olympic year in its own right. Like Boston, New York, Chicago, like those are big time races. And if you're top 3 in those, that like the Olympics is life-changing. It's life-changing,
Yeah, that's such a good point to look at it in the sense of like the selection process for the Olympics is also something that comes under scrutiny from like governing body to governing body, right? The way they do it and who they pick is not uniform throughout the world, right? Like some people it's based on like previous performances. For the US, it's based on like who performs on the day with an asterisk because it's more complicated than that. But yeah, but if you think of world majors being one of the more like meritocracy based moments, you were invited there because of your times and you are compensated based on said times as well. Mm-hmm. It does kind of beg this, like, it's tricky too, because I think like this is something that's so interesting to me as well, where I don't know how this relates to this, the debate around paying NCAA athletes, right, for what they do. And some people have this opinion, and usually it's people who are on the couch, not actually performing. But it's people who are like, oh, paying athletes it takes away from the integrity of the sport. People aren't going to try as hard if they're paid. And what we're talking about right now in the sport of running is like the exact opposite of that, right? It's because there's the appropriate financial incentives, or I wouldn't even say appropriate because it's never going to be enough for people to like sustain livings without having to race very often. But you are offering very enticing rewards, and that's why people are going to race hard or out of their gourd on that day.
Yep.
Super interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I just don't think in our sport people understand like the financial side of it and like how we make our living. Everyone's like, oh, well, you have a contract, so like you're good. And you're like, again, like a marathon contract, like my contract is heavily weighted on how I perform at marathons. Like majors, making an Olympic team, US trials, like that is like the bulk of my contract. And so again, I just think, yeah, people don't always understand like what else is riding on these races, outside of like, you picking them as an athlete and wanting to perform well there. And like, I always pick marathons also based off how I feel about it. And I want to be really excited about the marathon I do. So like that plays into it as well. But yeah, it's like anything else. Like you're doing this to like earn your livelihood. And so those decisions, like the certain decisions get made based off of that. And so, yeah, I think it's just interesting because we just don't really know how to talk about that, or we're not really talking about that. And same with like the NCAA athletes. Like I never had an issue with college athletes like making money for what they're doing and how hard they're working and their images being used and making their coaches tons of money. And like, like, sure, you don't want to like take away from like collegiate sports and like the purity of it. But at the same time, like being an athlete, I've been an athlete for like 20 years, and it's like, it's so hard, and it's like, I don't think there should be an issue with athletes getting compensated for like how hard they work and like what they're doing for like their universities. And you could almost look at the university as like, that's kind of like their sponsor and like marketing and all of that. So I don't see it as being that much different. But again, like we don't talk about that. And especially in running, I don't think people fully understand like what that looks like.
Yeah, I should get a heavy back on for an NIL episode because I'm sure
that would. That's a whole can of worms that just like separates families. Like it's like politics almost, like talking about that.
Yeah, and to your point about people not knowing the scope of the financial side, right? Like I'm sure there are plenty of people who might be listening or watching or just fans of the sport in general who have no idea what a reduction clause is.
Yes. And, God, those will haunt your dreams.
Right. To define a reduction clause for anyone. I feel like it's bad luck to say these things out loud. Like,
no, I don't want to manifest.
Yeah, I don't want to manifest this for anybody. So
I don't want to jinx anything.
I'm knocking on every piece of wood near me right now. For any professional athlete in a 7,000 mile radius of me right now. But reduction clauses were something that certain large brands were investing in or still are investing in, and involved signing an athlete on a certain scale. And most athletes are paid quarterly based on their bonuses and their base. But reduction clauses kind of work against that and say, if you do not hit certain performance standards from a quarter-to-quarter basis, you will be reduced quarterly. So while it looks good on paper to start at a certain point, it does create a lot of uncertainty around injury, just ebbs and flows of a career, just any medical things that come up, even let's be honest, like pregnancy as well, and how that may disproportionately affect women. So that's a reduction clause. We're moving on from this because this is just bad luck to talk about.
Yeah. But for those of you who didn't know, now you know. And we're pivoting.
We're pivoting from this for now. Yeah. So I don't want to interrupt your list of questions. Where are we at on that list?
I asked how its sponsors benefit. I run for Saucony, so it's like if Netflix was offering to do this whole thing, and I'm one of the athletes, they're centering around what does that look like? And so he was obviously visibility, right? That's how they would benefit, and he was you could also gear it, you could kind of focus it around a product, the Saucony Endorphin Elite 2 is in the works right now, and it's supposed to launch this fall. So it's if you're doing a build up to New York and that shoe's going to be available in November, you could kind of target certain products within your training. And then he was it's basically free advertising. He was it obviously creates a whole new fan base for you. Again, more visibility for Saucony, and then Saucony can obviously, again, I don't know the behind the scenes of what they're allowed to use and what they're not. I know that's a whole thing. You would know that.
True.
But yeah, he was just the biggest thing for your company or your sponsors, whoever you're working with, is visibility. And then you could talk about on film, this is the hydration that I use, or this is the, you can call out all of the products that you use, and then obviously people watching that film, it's open space to that. He's that's how they benefit. Is being on a Netflix documentary. And I was yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. So the production costs that's Netflix is taking on, or any CBC media channel, that is budget that brand does not need to allocate for organic views. And the validation through a professional athlete, which is the trifecta of what they want, right? It's product, it's product, its audience, and its athlete all kind of meeting in the same forum, which is exactly what they would want. I would just be curious to see if I'm a brand, I would want that access and the ability to kind of work with an athlete in tandem, be cool, when are they showing up? We're putting you in this. You don't have to necessarily talk about it, but you are going to be in the freshest stuff that we have during that time, and you're definitely going to change your shoes for the workout. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. You're definitely going to change maybe once or twice.
Exactly. Okay, we need to show up, and you're going to warm up in your long sleeve, and then you're going to go down to your sports bra. That's
A play by play of like every like hour you're out there. Like, this is what you're in. This is when you take this off. This is when you take the arm sleeves off. This is when you do this. Yeah. So like that was his point, is like they would have feedback based off of like how they prep you to like be filmed in like their product. Right. So
yeah. And I guess you could hope too that since this is in tandem with World Athletics, I know World Athletics does have an ASICS partnership, correct?
Yes.
Right. And like, so I know all the officials are in ASICS shoes and ASICS apparel, and I think they sell like ASICS gear for fans.
Yep.
It's co-branded. Something that I'm curious about is like what role World Athletics plays in, you know, the terms of this arrangement with Netflix, and then also how ASICS is working their way into that as well. It may be for like the sake of the purity of what they're trying to do. They're like, hey, every other thing we've done, F1, golf, tennis, like we're showing all different brands, like both visually and in some cases like Unchained, right? They're like actively talking about how these brands play a role in the success of athletes. So like that is probably something they'd want to like maintain. But I'm so curious because I think something that's, you know this better than I do, but in the running space, it's like a feast or famine kind of attitude in some cases with like money, sponsorships, and exposure, that there's been some very interesting and head scratching decisions made to promote certain brands for the sake of the contract.
Yep.
So I would definitely want to know if I was Saucony as well, be like, all right, what are we getting out of this?
100%. That's what I was asking. And like, again, like I know for like this documentary, it sounds like, they're going to have like an array of athletes. From what I understand, like they're all working with different sponsors or like a couple of different sponsors. So yeah, how does the overarching like ASICS play into that, obviously with their role with World Athletics, but then like as a brand like Adidas, if I'm like Noah Lyles, you know, it's like, well, okay, but like, I know, what do we get out of it? Like how are you going to like spin this thing or whatever? Because I think, again, like with running, like, you know, you go to the Olympic trials and it's like all Nike, right? So it's like, and again, you know this better than I do, but like there's so many things that brands, like that's what I hate, because it's like if I made the Olympics for Saucony, a company that has supported me for 10 years and supported me almost solely like from a product standpoint and getting me to the Olympics, I go to the Olympics and I have to wear a Nike kit. And I can only wear Saucony shoes. Saucony can't advertise. They can't say the word Olympics. Like they can't even really market fully, like having an athlete there. And then athletes get like penalized, I think, from what like I have understood from like Emma Coburn. She was telling me like when she won her first medal in like Rio, she put her New Balance spikes around so that like New Balance got in all the shots, but like apparently like that was not allowed. Like it is mind-blowing to me that like you can't like market, your sponsor can't market you, and you can't really market your sponsor on like one of the biggest global stages like in athletics. Like what's
true?
It's insane.
I remember when Molly Seidel did that after winning. Through the shoes over the shoulder at the Olympics, right? Which took third. And if I'm Molly, just in that scenario, I'm like, I'm probably gonna get fined for this. Yeah. But like, do me a favor, like pay the fine for me. Like you got.
Well, that's 100%. Like I think companies are starting to be like, like we would pay it. Like it doesn't matter. Like they could fine you whatever, but like if we're in the shot, like come on. But like that's so dumb that's even like a conversation you have to have. Like I don't know. That's so that it. So again, with the documentary part, that's why partially I asked that question, because I'm just like, do your sponsors get in on this? You know, because is it like under the banner of World Athletics, under the banner of USATF? Like what's it under? And like, is it like an Olympics, like an Olympic world type situation where like you're on this huge global stage and you have all this marketing, but like you can't show a Saucony logo, you know, like they're going to like blur it out or whatever, you know, like that would suck.
Yeah, I know. It is really frustrating. And I think of like, this reminds me of a criticism that Michael Johnson had of this whole docuseries that's being made. And he's like, I think this is before it was confirmed or like maybe early on in the process. And he was like, hey, all these other sports that are being featured have like pretty good bones, at least from the outside looking in. And like track and field and just running in general does not. So he's like, I don't know if this is going to do what we think it will for sport. And that kind of like illustrates it kind of well, like how athletes are kind of placed between production and brand. And it isn't like a symbiotic relationship or something that works together in some cases.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they like navigate that and like what that actually ends up shedding light on. I wouldn't say there's like good bones right now. It's a mess. At least on like the US side of things from what like I understand. And then Dan had some thoughts. He was like, I would want, like, he had a good question. He was like, what happens if you get injured? Like, and they're doing like this whole focus on like your buildup, you know, and like, and if you are getting paid, like, what does that look like? Do you not? Do you get half? Like,
right.
He's like, what if you can't participate in like the New York City Marathon, like the whole thing that they're doing it on? Like, what would happen then? It's like suddenly you got injured 4 weeks out and then you can't compete. Like, you know, do they just like shift and pivot that storyline? Like all of that. Yeah, he said, would the compensation be a flat fee? Would there be a possibility of percentage of profits if successful? And if so, how would that success be quantified? Yeah, he just said that showbiz is notorious for creative accounting, where even hugely successful ventures show like no profit. So would there be incentives for how well the athlete does in the accumulating event, like the marathon? He was like, that's the question I would ask on my end. And we would want answers to that. That's interesting. I didn't think about that at all.
Yeah. I even think in the scope of like, let's say you get renewed for a second season, right?
Right.
Or they renew this, like, how do I know I'm getting invited back? Like, am I showing, like what, like you said, metrics of success? Because if they're looking at viewership totals or tallies, it's not going to be indicative of how individual personalities are hitting. Are they looking at tweets qualitatively of like what people are saying? Are they looking at like, hey, Laura's had a bump in followers of like 400%, like her stock is super rising? Or is it based on just like purely performances? Hey, are the times like compelling enough for this to be a feature? So it's such a good point that like in any relationship like this, especially when you're a third party-ish in it, it's like, what are your metrics for success here? That's such a great point from.
Yeah, and I was like, see, this is why I have you. Like, this is why I don't know if I can negotiate my own deals, because I'm like, I wouldn't have asked that. Like, I have no idea. Like, yeah, how are they measuring that? Like, what is it that they're looking at to like quantify all of that? Like, I never would have, I don't think that way. So I was like, that's a really interesting point that you would want clarity on before going into something like this. And then his other thoughts were just like, would it be like US centric? Again, like we talked about, like, would you be focusing on like a build to the Olympic trials? And then obviously like who, like if you hopefully making the team or like the Olympics, or do you do a world major? And that's where I was like, I would do a world major. Like, I think that storyline is not that like storylines building up to like a US, because again, we're one of the very few countries that does an Olympic trials. So I think that would be interesting to like obviously focus on that. But again, we agreed that the storyline would be, I think, really cool to do more of like a world major, just because of all the different like global storylines you can kind of tell as everyone's prepping for this one thing and shedding light on that side of the sport that like, if you're not like a true fan, like you don't really understand that side of it. No one really knows what those races actually mean. So yeah, so that was kind of it. That's like, he's like, that's how I would start. Like, those are all the things you'd want to know right away. And then you'd have other questions and things as you like get answers to these. And then like you kind of continue the negotiations. But he was like, those are all like the big ones that you'd want to know like up front before like diving into something like this.
That's such a comprehensive view. And I really appreciate like all of the effort that you two put into thinking about that. And I would love to have all three of us on to like have a little bit more of a take of this. Maybe when there's like some more developments in the series, then to get the agent and athlete together to kind of respond and react to how this is conveyed.
That would be really cool.
Yeah. You got me thinking of like when you're talking about the trials and how like that's not necessarily a compelling angle from like the pro side, I feel like the one angle that could be taken on the trials is like it's like racing for pink slips. Like who's performing well enough to get a contract through this?
100%.
That would be wild to see.
Yep.
You've seen this, right? Like with your experience, like in the 10K and so on, and or track related stuff. I just remember seeing people at trials on day one, like in the first round, racing a college singlet, and then they move on to the semis or the finals, and they're like in a Nike singlet, right? And like they're on a gear deal that was like signed and handshaked over like a basket of fries at lunch, and to see those things play out, I think that is a wide.
I agree. And there's especially like track and field, like every time I watch the track and field trials, like they're doing a better job of like highlighting athletes that like aren't in the mainstream, and like they're highlighting athletes that aren't like the favorites going in. And it's like, I remember, I think it was probably 2021. I don't remember his name so bad, but he was in the steeple and he made the final, and they were talking about how he works like midnight shifts at Walmart to like fund his running. Do you remember who that was? Like he basically worked all these crazy Walmart shifts and like was doing all these different side hustles to like fund going to races and like getting the standard and like making it to the trials. And he was like 5th. Like he didn't make the team, but he was like so freaking close. And then I think he ended up ultimately signing, I want to say like probably a Nike deal. I can't remember. But like those are like that's where the trials is really cool. And I think if you did a series focusing on that like that could be cool. Because again, there's just so many different ways that athletes show up. And I love an underdog story. Like again, like I love, as much as I love like the Michael Jordans and like LeBron Jameses and like diving into like those types of athletes, like headspaces and like what makes them essentially one of the greatest of all times to ever play their sport. I also love an underdog story of like, it just showcases that there's so many different ways to get here. And there's so many different ways to have that success. And I feel like we don't, especially in the US, like we don't always highlight that. Like we just like to focus on who's the best and kind of just like, then we talk about how they got there, but we just like go straight for like the big names, which like I get, but I don't know. I think that's a cool piece of like, if you did more of a US kind of focus, is like finding some athletes that are a little under the grain of it and just kind of their journey there. Because I was like, that is wild. He was working like midnight shifts at Walmart to get himself to the Olympic trials. Like, yeah, that's running for you. Like, I mean, yeah, it's crazy.
I want like an insight into like Gabby Rooker getting a deal for the trials. Like that, that's me is wild. Like Race for Mill City had a series, did not come out of nowhere, right? Yeah. Gabby Rooker's been doing well for a while now. Was racing for Mill City, based in Minneapolis. They have a Nike relationship as a running company racing team. And she's a part of the like the Dream Leader program. And that was really, but like that doesn't paint the whole picture. But even that in itself was very interesting. Of like, all right, being in the orbit of this brand somehow like triggered this contract to somebody being like, you are the person that we're betting on, or supporting from this point forward. And kind of returning to a point we've spoken about before, it's like, what are the terms of that? Because I know sometimes these like overnight contracts that happen at trials or leading in or leading out of it are performance based. And it's like, hey, if you make the final, like we'll give you a 1-year deal. Or if it's, it's predicated on performance more so than like, you know what, you're the person that we want long term. So even that, it's just like a thing to explore.
Yes.
But yeah, very much appreciate like the depth of what you two bring to it. I did have some questions to kind of reflect on what is currently planned for that. Did you feel good moving on?
Yeah. Let's move on.
I know that you talked about and you've mentioned, right, that they're focusing on 100, 200 meter disciplines. That is obviously different than your discipline. Like in some cases, you need shack.
This is so different.
And I guess from the athlete perspective, but not that discipline perspective, what I guess would like benefits or drawbacks do you have in your mind about those disciplines and featuring those disciplines in a series like this? I mean, it's kind of hard to compare this to like your own experience without comparing to, well, the marathon would provide this does or this doesn't. But what are some initial reactions you have around 100s?
Yeah, I think initially, like my first initial thought was like, that's really sick that they're going to like shed light on the sport of track and field and like give it a little bit more of the respect that I think it deserves when it comes to like how people view like mainstream sports and like bringing fans into what we do. I think that's always been a struggle for track and field. And I think you got a little bit of that with like Usain Bolt and like the sprinters are more mainstream. I think people really like understand what they're watching when they're watching 100 meters, when they're watching 200. Like there's kind of like more like initial like drama and like it's fast and it's just like boom, boom, boom. And like you don't have to have this like long like attention span or like you don't have, there's like not really like a ton of like tactics and like it's just easier for like people outside of running to understand what they're watching and it makes a lot more sense. And so I think largely in that way, sprinting is much more mainstream. And like, you know, you have big personalities like Sha'Carri Richardson, Noah Lyles, like Christian Coleman, like Fred Curley. Like you have these big like personalities and like, you know, they're kind of like, again, like you have big personalities in what's already a little bit more mainstream for running. And so that was my one like drawback with it where I was like, that's really cool that they're going to like shed light on these athletes and like not being a sprinter myself, I'm going to like, that's going to be really interesting for me to like get an inside look into like how does like the other half of our sport train and like prepare and like handle all of that. And like, again, being huge names like that, like there's so much they're carrying on their shoulders. So like, it'll be really cool to like see all of that. But part of me was also like, well, but like people already know who these people are. And again, like I get it. Like when you do documentaries, you kind of need that catch and you need kind of some names that people are like, oh yeah, like I watched them play in the US Open or like, oh, I know who Michael Jordan is or like, you know, but like, I don't know. That was like my one thing where I was like, God, like it'd be cool if they did like sprinters, but like, why not pull like an 800 or like, you know, like there's so many different events in track and field where you're like, oh, there's so much like, it would just be cool if it, and like maybe they'll do a spin-off where like they're starting with 100, 200. It's a great diving in point. Again, for people outside of running to really kind of be like, I'm going to click on this and watch this tonight because like I know who Noah Lyles is or I watched Sha'Carri Richardson, like, you know, like win gold. Like they know those names like a Usain Bolt and it draws them in. So then I think it'll be interesting to see like what comes from this if they do like more of a comprehensive series where they start with the big stuff to get people to click and then they kind of open it. My hope is that they would expand on it and they bring in like 1,500, 800, like 5K, you know, like I get 10K in marathon or maybe a little bit like different, but like, I don't know, like I just hope that there's like, it'd be cool if it ended up being more comprehensive where like it pulls people in initially with names they maybe already know. But then it kind of like opens up like what is track and field, because track and field is so much deeper than the 100 and 200. Like that's not track and field, like that's not an all-encompassing thing. Track and field is bigger than Usain Bolt, you know. So it's like I liked it, like, but then I was like, oh, like hopefully that it can become more comprehensive because this is just such a tiny like snapshot of the sport. And is that enough to bring people into like all the different pieces of the sport that like just aren't being showcased in anything?
I totally get that, especially when you're talking about how an outside viewer who doesn't understand the sport can maybe connect to like this raw speed element.
Yeah.
Just like they don't need to know about technique or tactics like you mentioned. I do think that something that 1 and 2s could bring in potentially is like when you think about raw speed, there's the ability to draw a comparison with other sports potentially. Yeah. Like I've seen, right, there was like that sports science show back in the day, and I remember they had like Christian Coleman run a 40 and like compare it to NFL players, and he's run a faster time in the 40 than anyone has. Yeah. And I think they did a similar thing. There was like a graphic that went around about like Kylian Mbappe plays for PSG. He's one of the best, you know, soccer players in the world, and they like clocked his 100 time like in a game, and they're like, and that's still a full second slower than this athlete. So maybe there's like that could be the play, like you were saying, of bringing people into it. And showing them just based on raw times, like they're faster than every single other athlete.
Yep.
And
Because people can compete that. They're like, wait, Christian Coleman, there's a guy out there that can run a faster 40 than like, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Like, again, like I get that. Like, that's the hook, right? Like, that's how you bring people that have nothing to do with running right now. That's clickbait, because like everyone can kind of comprehend, like, this is the fastest man in the world. Like, oh my God, like, right? And like that was the whole craze with like Usain Bolt. And then like they marketed him almost in the same way against like other really big name athletes in different sports. Like, that's 100% how you have to kind of like do it to begin even growing interest into like, well, what else does track and field have?
Yeah. And I was also thinking too about, you're saying like, I hope this opens up more, right, to other disciplines in the future. And it reminds me how like cyclical the sport can be, especially with like what events are most interesting right now. It's kind of similar to like boxing in a way, where there's certain like the heavyweights in the 90s, like everyone wanted to watch that. And then now it's like watching people at like 170 is interesting because like the personalities there are the ones to watch. And then Dalil and Muhammad go head to head was huge. But we haven't seen that matchup in forever. So like that would be a storyline that's a little bit like, all right, now you had a Femke going head to head. But that landscape looks different now. That if you made that bet in a docuseries sense, let's say 3 years ago, it looks a whole lot different than it does now.
Yep.
And maybe you hope that World Athletics can kind of guide the trends accordingly. I mean, I'm biased. I think it would be really cool to do field events as well, because there's so much technique involved with it. But I mean, it's like they do the throws. It's just like, hey, chase the elite, and like the shot put, just generally, like USA owns it. You know, that might not be as compelling. It's like the world. Yeah, or just like every episode of the pole vault being like, Mondo did it again.
Yeah, he jumped 30 feet.
Right.
But again, like it. You just hope that there's roads, like there's ways down the road where like it can kind of include all these other pieces of the sport. This is maybe just like a starting off point of like, this is how you engage people right away. Because there's just so much, but again, like I'm biased, I'm in it, I see it, but I'm like, like even like the mile, like everyone knows what a mile is. Everyone kind of gets the sub 4, like, I mean, every time I tell people, like just recently I was out with like a group of people that are not runners at all. So like they were trying to wrap their brains around the fact that like I can do that for a living. And like the first question they ask is like, well, what's your mile time? And so it's like people kind of have a concept of like what that looks like. So I think it'd be interesting, like maybe you shift to that. I don't know. Like there's so many different things that I think you could do. So again, that's why this was so exciting of like, well, this is a jumping off point for the sport. And hopefully it can kind of expand off of that. And it'd be cool if there were like different series if this like was successful.
Yeah. Any last questions or remarks on like the perspective you bring into it, or things that you would like to see or need answers?
Not really. I'm excited to see what it's like to be one of the fastest people in the world. Like bring it on. I want to know what that's like. I'll never know what it's like to run 9 seconds for 100. I will never know. I want to kind of know as I watch this documentary, like what is that life like? So I'm into that. It'll be the closest I ever come.
Yes. Maybe we'll, once we start seeing episodes, we should do episode companions.
We should. Oh, Drew, let's do that. I'm so for that. I love doing that.
I'm down.
Done.
Episode.
We're going to do our own spinoff. This was just a jumping off point.
That's right. Yeah. This is when we announce the plans for another creative project.
I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Laura. I really appreciate it. I'm excited for, people to engage with like your thoughts on the matter and to just kind of grow their, curiosity as we get closer to things. Still no release date yet.
Right? I know. Everything I read, it was like sometime in like summer of 2024. So you're like, are they gonna kind of like go through the Olympics and then like release it like in the fall? Or are they just like the build up to the Olympics? It just says like 2024, and you're like, I don't know what that means. We're in 2024, but I wonder if they're doing like an Olympic thing. I don't know.
my bet is that they're going into the Olympics, because like track trials still feels too early. Like in
Yeah.
the US track trials, I feel like the play that Netflix is making, it's my assumption of it, is like they're building out these markets in the US with just like the viewership they have. So they could potentially say like, we're going to put this out to get people excited for track trials, and you could view it and then go on to, because that's a world event instead of an Olympic event, right? So they can build their own cachet and then go into the global competition. But
right, because they're obviously doing that with global sprinters, they said. So yeah, there's that piece too.
Right.
But yeah, it's so vague. Like, no, I don't know. I don't know. I have so many questions. But apparently they were saying that there were Netflix, or like there were cameras at last year's USA's prepping for Budapest, like in like the athlete warm-up area and stuff. They were saying that like big cameras and things were being seen following certain athletes. So you're like, well, so the footage is going all the way back before like Budapest? Like, I don't know. So it'll be interesting.
I'm excited, but
me too.
Thank you so much again. Yeah, excited to see what comes.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. This was fun.